to our next episode of our ESG Paradigm Shift Series. Episodes in this series will examine different angles of the ESG phenomenon and its broader implications for finance and prosperity. Something bigger is happening in markets. Is ESG just a symptom of more fundamental shifts?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. Today, we're in studio with, in New York City, I should say, with Dr. Shiva Rajgopal, who is the Kester and Byrnes professor at Columbia University Business School. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Kaitlyn.
We have invited Professor on because he has an incredible body of work, of academic work, that addresses a lot of the big topics in business and ESG today. In fact, there's too many to even cover in one episode.
You can always have me back.
Yes, absolutely. But I wanted to have you on for that perspective. We were talking a little bit before about where does an academic perspective really add value? Maybe we could start there.
So as you know, I'm a full-time academic and maybe a part-time journalist. There's tons of good work that happens in academia. We spend 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 7 years working through a problem. It gets rigorously reviewed by academic referees, and then it just gets published somewhere and nobody reads it. So it's such a shame. This tremendous human capital expended on trying to address perhaps the same problem that you and others care about. Except none of that actually comes to light because it's technical. Some of that needs to be translated. Sometimes, we academics are naive and we end up answering questions that no one has. But by and large, there's a lot of wisdom there. And we are also good at unpacking sound bites. One of the nice things about social media and so on is that it's easy to reach other people, which is why I write for Forbes and I love it. The downside, of course, is that, there's a volley of insults and sometimes the misinformation. Mm-hmm. And people rarely unpack the headlines and look behind and beyond, especially the data. And that's the place, I think, where academics can add tremendous value. In fact, I encourage all my colleagues, go write for Medium or Substack because your voice needs to be heard. As academics, we're also very nervous about being wrong. That's why I tell them everything you do is a first cut at history. You're going to be wrong, but you're going to be relevant. Which is the downside to being super rigorous and you do a postmortem 20 years later. But what is the point of doing that? There's lots of value to add. In fact, one of the taglines at Columbia Business School is theory meets practice. If one takes that to heart, I think there's tremendous value for both society and for, the professional satisfaction of the academic's own career.
I think with ESG in particular, right, there's been, after it, we all were quietly plugging away, doing our thing for many years, and then it became a political football last year. There's great value in the studies and the data behind these things to kind of cut through some of that noise. So I'd love to have you talk about the evolution of ESG in your view. In fact, we should probably back up. I didn't read a bio since we're on the couch today. How did your career evolve and what perspective you bring? And then how does that inform your view of the ESG evolution, say?
So it's interesting. So my day job is that of an accounting academic. And I view accounting as more about accountability. It's hard to excite young people to go into accounting. Mm-hmm. But if you frame that as a quest for accountability, then suddenly, things look interesting. So I've always been interested in the G of the ESG. Mm-hmm. Been working forever on things like, boards, executive compensation. Does the accounting model even reflect the economics of the company? And one way to view this evolution, there are many lenses, of course, through which you can view this, but one way to view this might be maybe the accounting model, by and large, hasn't kept up with changes in technology, changes in social and stakeholder perceptions and expectations. A lot of ESG could simply be seen as risk management for which the conventional accounting model doesn't provide the information that you might need. Intangibles being an example. Maybe I'll just back up and talk about what I see in ESG. And I started out as a huge skeptic. And I'm somewhere in the middle now, which hopefully, gives me some credibility with your audience. If I say something, hopefully it means something. So here's the thing. So if you look at a standard income statement of, say, pick any company, doesn't matter, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, there are two big problems. One, we set the cost of natural capital to zero in our financial statements. What does natural capital mean? Broadly defined, natural resources. If you're a mining company, it means the natural resource you extracted, whether it's oil or whether it's gold, soil, biodiversity, etc. So I don't know how to value natural capital, but it is certainly not zero. That's one premise. The second premise is that income statements and balance sheets of companies are not very good at measuring externalities, both positive and negative. Now, the negative stuff gets a lot of attention, and justifiably, and your audience knows that. But I might also pause to reflect on the positive externalities. Example, how much do we pay for Microsoft Office? Maybe $100 a year or something in terms of license fees. How much value does that add to your life? Despite all our frustrations with PowerPoint and cut paste and all that, it adds a tremendous amount of value.
I could take issue with Outlook, but go ahead.
You know what I mean.
I know.
So that's the positive externality. Yeah. So when a company does R&D and puts out a product, it probably captures 5-10% of the contribution it made to society, and everybody else captures, like you and me, the benefits of Microsoft putting out that software. So both positive and negative externalities are ignored, mismeasured, not reported, and then suddenly, ESG becomes a very interesting topic. I mean, I was drawn to it purely from the managerial accountability standpoint. Who's keeping an eye on management in general? And I think this has become a bigger issue now because of ETFs and indexing.
Yes, so exchange-traded funds.
Yeah, ETFs. Yeah, so the value chain that links a saver, which is you and me, through a 401k or a 403b plan. This is how we invest, right? We are the ones providing capital. Right. So the value chain that links that money eventually to, say, the treasury at Apple or Microsoft has become so complicated and so intermediated, with so many asset management agencies effectively doing their own thing. They have their own objective functions and they're trying to maximize something, whatever that is, fees or political capital and so on. It's become remarkably disconnected to the point where you have to wonder, when people talk about shareholder value, who's this mythical shareholder that nobody's met? Is it BlackRock, Vanguard? Well, I don't know, I mean, they're custodians for our money. It's you and me. So the accountability issue in my mind has become, arguably even worse. And because the value chain has become so disconnected, it's led to a whole bunch of intermediaries. You have sell-side analysts. We don't get to, talk much to the buy side because we don't know what they do, but we can observe a lot of what the sell side does. There are credit rating agencies, ESG rating agencies, proxy advisors. One has to, wonder about their objectives. Are they really producing information relevant to keeping companies reasonably honest? Are they keeping an eye on over or under valuations, et cetera, et cetera? So one way to interpret ESG is, A, it's probably a failure of the classic accounting model.
Wow.
In producing information to help you manage risks.
Wow.
B, it's a call for more accountability given the indexing revolution, which as individuals is fantastic for us. Who wants to, do the research on the 500 stocks in the S&P 500 or the Wilshire 5000? So, if you have a computer index fund that does this at, like, say, 0.03%, 0.04% expense ratio, that's superb. But as a system, one has to start asking, who's going to do any kind of research? Where's the, if active dies in some sense, who's building relationships with management? In one way to think about this whole idea is that the ultimate form of ESG is hold things for the long term. So we often think of Warren Buffett as somebody who hates ESG, and I've written pieces on that. But I'm now beginning to think maybe he's the ultimate ESG guy. Because if you hold stock for like 20 years, a company cannot do well unless you keep the stakeholders happy. I mean, if you piss employees off, you piss suppliers off, How will you survive? So maybe the ultimate ESG idea is hold things for the long term, as opposed to, what I'm writing about now, this notion of long washing.
Ooh.
Makes sense, right? I mean, a lot of people talk about, it's like greenwashing. A lot of people talk about being long-term. Are they really long-term?
Wow.
If that's the case, why are they so worried about, short-term results of any kind? Partly because it depends on how their own managers are compensated. So it's a nexus of compensation contracts that you have to worry about, right? I mean, if somebody claims to be long-term, what's the ideal contract? They should hold the exact same portfolio that they're selling, right? I mean, that's one way to lock in and align incentives.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll stop there. There's so many other macro trends you can probably pin on, or at least explain the evolution of ESG through many lenses, but those are at least two lenses to look at.
I think those are incredibly important. And I find it interesting that we, from the very beginning, our simple definition of ESG, anything that can affect the value of your company that's not on your balance sheet or not on your financial statements. That's how we've always defined it. At first at Global Affairs Associates and now at Climeco. As we dove very deep into this space, that was our take, right? And it's interesting that it comes down to what does modern accounting practice really capture, and has the world outgrown that?
100%. In fact, if you could maybe go to the archives, we don't do any of that anymore these days, right? When was the last time I went to a library? I don't know. But if you were to say, go pull out the annual report of some company that's been around forever, US Steel or something, and compare their income statements and balance sheets back in the 30s or the 40s to what we have today, you'll notice very few changes, which is arguably at the heart of the problem. It's unrecognizable today, right? The economy compared to what it was in the 30s and the 40s. Globalization, services, intangibles, outsourcing of a lot of production to Asia.
Huge.
The accounting systems, in my view, hasn't kept pace. Hasn't kept pace. And that has perhaps led to this kind of movement / outrage / demand for alternate information, coupled with the financialization of the economy, the ETFs and the passive indexing, because that keeps marching on. Technology eats everything. In the world of finance, what has technology done? It's ETFized the world. And simultaneously, being an accounting professor, I worry about things like who reads a 10K anymore?
Right.
We have classes in this. I have like 30, 40 dedicated people who come to my classes and take these classes. But 700 of the students that we admit every year should ideally take these classes. Wow. So my demand's 40 out of 700, which tells you that people are not really investing as much in fundamentals data as they should, because there's tons of information. How do you regulate? Our model of regulation is disclosure. So we put out 1,000 pages of disclosure, sustainability report, proxy statements, 10Ks, a bunch of 8Ks. But somebody has to actually observe, process, and make sense of that. And are the intermediaries doing the best they can given that information? I'm not sure. Where is the incentive to bet on something that doesn't make sense? It's very hard to short a stock that gets into the S&P, for instance. Tesla, for instance, if you look at Tesla's valuation, it's still bigger than the next 6 or 7 competitors combined.
Wow.
So the market is effectively saying, not only will Tesla sell every car in the world, the competitors would basically do nothing to compete. Right? But it's very hard to take a negative view, partly because indexing makes it difficult, because we all mechanically keep buying the same stock. Being active is hard, because it's very hard to beat an index even 10 years out, 11 years out, especially after expenses. And once you factor in taxes, makes it even harder. But that leads to this big existential question, who's keeping an eye on any of this? Wow. Because the indexers are effectively free riding, meaning taking advantage of the information production that somebody is investing in buying the stock and changing stock prices.
And perhaps that's a similar issue that, there's so much uproar about funds tagged or misnamed as an ESG fund or an ESG index. And we, years ago submitted comments to the SEC on this because there was a lot of misnaming things that made no sense, right? We do need better guidelines on that, but it's almost the same issue. It's just carried over to the ESG stuff as well, where, what is the standard you're using, right? At least in the, say, financial, even if they're very, very old practice that may be antiquated, right? There's some consistency. And then you throw in this new thing, trying to meet, it's a demand, right? It didn't just happen because, right, there was a demand for other type of information that wasn't captured there, right? That led to this whole movement of ESG. So perhaps that's part of it, is that then a lot of the darts being thrown at ESG funds, and some of it's absolutely legitimate, right? Because of using the wrong name, et cetera. It's simply the same thing, right? You could say about the broader
100%. 100%. So let's kind of step back a little bit.
Interesting.
Labeling, policing labeling is a huge problem, right? So for instance, if you go to a supermarket now, how many types of eggs can you buy? Omega-6, omega-3, natural, cage-free, organic. What does all that mean? Who knows? And who's policing these labels? So we have the exact same problem in the non-ESG mutual fund space. So I've written a piece about that. There's so many funds that call themselves quality funds. What is quality? I mean, when I hear the word quality, I get nervous. What does that mean? So there are a couple of funds that actually define what they mean by quality. The vast majority don't. What's a value fund? What's a balanced fund? What's a growth fund? So this labeling issue has been around forever.
Yeah.
And, if you know, elementary math, right? NC2, if you have 5,000 stocks, I can create permutations and combinations of an infinite number of those and hence create a fund. Right? And how do I describe that? And what are people really buying? And hence they look at performance. If you complain, we often complain, people chase performance. What else is there? I mean, they can't understand the other stuff. At least they understand performance.
Yeah.
So the labels are super complicated to police.
Yeah.
And as you rightly point out, the ESG fund world has also misused labels.
Absolutely,
partly because it's so hard to measure the ESG-ness of a company.
Right.
So what do you do?
It has to be clearly defined if you're really going to...
People do negative screening. It's easy to kind of verify, right? And of course, there's inconsistency there. Why am I not buying nuclear? I don't know. But okay, I'm not buying oil. I'm not buying coal. I'm not buying tobacco. I'm not buying guns. Yeah. That's a bit easier to define and measure.
True. Yeah. And maybe that's part of the popularity, even though, we can point out all day long, just because a fund is supposedly a green fund, right? How do you know if your solar panels are, where was that mined? If you look under the hood, right, there's a lot of issues with some of these funds. But I think to your point, it kind of comes back to this, well, how do you define it? Well, how do you define it? If you're not disclosing how you define it, then sure, we're all going to look under the hood and see issues.
Well, so it's interesting you raise this, So I teach a climate risk elective at Columbia, and, the students are obviously, 20-year-olds. What I find striking is that many of them invest based on their values. So there's several things here. One, there's a lot of legacy money that's going to get passed on to these kids. And we try very hard not to be elitist and so on, but we get a certain profile, as you can imagine, at Columbia. They will invest with values, even if the traditional system now doesn't care. So, even if it doesn't make crazy alpha, they just don't want you to lose too much money. They're also not as naive as we would imagine because they understand this is all too complicated. So unless the connection between the owner and the manager is tight, it's virtually impossible to tell, Apple's CFO or CEO what you should do. Why should they listen to you? You're like 0.001% of the stock.
Right.
Of course, they'll say the right things in the media. Having impact or influence, unless you're a private fund, is virtually impossible. So that's one idea. The second idea, something that's been bothering me for a while is the disconnect between us as consumers and us as ESG investors. And this is the other thing I'm kind of worried about. I love the young generation, but I also worry Has ESG investing to them effectively become something like saying like on Facebook, I support the women in Afghanistan. It's a horrible problem. What am I going to do about it? I feel bad. For a moment, I say I support the thing and maybe I give $10. Is that ESG investing? Are you changing the way you consume, for instance? Mm-hmm. One of the statistics I read, which kind of really bothered me, apparently 150 billion pieces of new clothing get made every year. Divide that by 8 billion population, 20 uniformly distributed, 20 pieces of clothing a year. Have I really stopped consuming that much? I can say I'm vegan, at least.
Yeah, you've hit on a problem very close to my heart with, I have this other firm that is a marketplace for clothing repair, recycling, etc. So I don't even think you knew that. So it's funny you bring that up because it's very important to me. And I think that disconnect, right? This is when we talk to brands about this issue, what you often hear is, well, our customers say they want more choices, but when it comes to the actual purchasing, they continue to purchase the cheapest thing.
This is so important.
It's a huge issue.
Before we go on and on about, and I agree with you, there's mislabeling and so on. It's complicated.
Yes.
But some kind of internal consistency in our behavior as consumers and ESG investors would be useful to worry about.
And I think that's so much of it is the education. It's one of the things that makes me, I'm glad we just did this podcast. This was not my dream to be I don't know, I can't call myself a journalist or by any means, but kind of doing a show, right? Never in a million years would this have been my goal. It happened because we were having these conversations privately and thinking, God, more people need to hear this. More people need to understand the complexity behind these issues. The average person needs to be able to be informed to make those choices and to make choices and see the connection between their own choices and these big issues that we're dealing with. It's something that we all play a part in.
Yeah, you're right. Neither am I, what do I know about journalism? I just write stuff, long pieces. And I often joke sometimes, this is such an arcane topic, nobody will read it. But it's important to make that point. So just as a responsible citizen, and that's why, people get so worried about social media. And granted, there have been issues.
Yes.
But it's also highly liberating and empowering. You probably wouldn't do this. I probably wouldn't write for Forbes. And the world would be worse off. For not hearing these diverse voices, both on the left and the right, to be fair.
Yes, absolutely. We have a few minutes left, and I thought we might, if we had time, get to your petition, the recent petition that you submitted, I believe, with a co-author to the SEC, specifically about compensation. So now having met you and talked to you, I think I understand better the context for it, which is, our accounting statements aren't telling us enough information. So tell us a little bit about your petition.
So, I'm sure most of your listeners have taken a high school economics class. And what do we teach in a high school economics class? How is value created? It's some combination of materials, like in your fashion business, labor, some capacity broadly defined as, say, the studio is capacity to produce this. And managerial talent. So this is like elementary economics. This is how value gets created in an enterprise. But if you take this framework to a modern day income statement, it is virtually impossible to get straight answers to any of these questions. These are like a 6-line income statement, which will say revenues, cost of goods sold, SG&A, R&D, tax, income. Where's materials? Somewhere in cost of goods sold, except I don't know how much. Where's labor? Everywhere there is labor. It's in R&D, it's in SG&A, it's in cost of goods sold, the manufacturing part, except they don't tell me how much, etc., etc. So to me, the reporting model is sadly fundamentally broken. This is again a conversation that is had between the experts and the pundits, and people don't get involved. It's because it's seen as so technical, this is like accounting stuff, who knows. But it's a mistake. And part of the idea, this was like a tiny initiative to say that before you talk about how human capital is your biggest asset, which is what every company talks about, right? How we care so much about...
It's a big topic for SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board.
Yeah, how we, corporate culture is the most important off-balance sheet asset, which all of which I firmly believe. But only 15% of US companies even tell us what their labor costs broadly defined are.
Wow.
15%. For the other 85, and this includes all the big names, the Amazons, the Netflixes, the Apples, we don't know. This is absurd to me. So all we're asking for is elementary. At least tell us how much money you spend on your labor force. And then, of course, we ask for deeper things which are likely to be controversial. Contractors. My rough guess would be, if labor cost for a company is $100, contractor costs are probably $30, $40, $50. It's big. So to understand labor, even purely from a investor standpoint, forgetting all the social stuff, I want to know how much money are you spending on, both full-time and part-time and contractors. Yeah. Then, if you really want to, operationalize your vision about culture and so on, at the very minimum, I need to know about tenure. How long is an employee with you? And turnover. I mean, I'm not even asking for abnormal turnover. All that is a definitional quagmire. But simple turnover, which I can then compare across companies. Yeah. So that was the petition with the SEC. So the FASB, which is the rule-making body for accountants.
The Financial Accounting
Standards Board. I know it's like...
FASB.
You're used to that. In the world of ESG, I often say it's like death by acronyms.
Yes,
There's so many,
it totally
right?
Is.
Yeah. But so the FASB has now said they'll ask companies to disaggregate information about labor, how much of labor in cost of goods sold, how much of labor in SG&A, which is super, absolutely great. But the other things like turnover, tenure, contractor stuff, I don't know, it's probably beyond their remit, and maybe the SEC will hopefully address this in their new human capital proposal that's going to come out. And, this is beyond politics and so on. This is like elementary high school economics brought to life.
Right.
We're not even talking about anything else, which we can talk about if you want, like DEI and other things. And
just how can you keep an employee longer than 9 months,
it's mind-numbing that nobody's complaining more about this, right? Partly because, as I said, who reads a 10K? And these conversations have become, so technocratic, left to the experts. That's why I do a lot of these things. I talk to anybody who's willing to talk to me to simply spread the word. Look at financial statements. Sometimes I often joke in class, don't read the National Enquirer, read proxy statements. There's so many things going on.
It's fascinating.
It's true. How the CEO gets paid.
Right.
What are the perquisites? What are the control arrangements? It's really interesting stuff.
Even the things that are tucked in about risks.
Yeah.
Right. The risk disclosures can be very revealing, or the legal liabilities sections, right? All of that sort of thing. So I'm sorry if I missed it, did you get a response from the SEC?
Well, it doesn't work that way.
How
does it work is a good question. It's a black box. They don't tell you. But concurrently, the FASB started talking more about this aggregation idea, which is good. So I'm happy to interpret that as progress.
Yeah.
But more remains to be done. I just posted a piece a couple of days back about how they don't talk about contractors. They don't tell me in that compensation number how much is salary versus bonus versus equity and so on. Equity as in stock, right? Options, et cetera, et cetera. Right. But it's a small win, and it does suggest that, hopefully responsible advocacy pays. So it's a call for everybody, especially the institutional types. I mean, I guest teach occasionally at NYU Law. They bring in these, governance officers of many of these state pension funds, and I ask them, how many of you read a proxy statement? They've all read the proxy statement. How many of you read the 10K? 10%.
Oof.
So you cannot make sense of governance without understanding the financials and the economics of the company. They have to talk to each other.
Yeah.
This is the other issue with the ESG world, right? I haven't checked in the last couple of weeks, but Tesla had put out its 2021 impact report the last I checked. And this is 2023. So these two worlds are in different silos, and they have to talk to each other more from so many perspectives, right?
Oh, yes.
The control mindset that the accountants have is missing in ESG.
Yes.
But ESG talks about things that the accountants can learn from. At the very least, if you want to have impact, you should be putting out a quote-unquote impact report almost at the same time you're putting out your financial report.
Oh my gosh,
otherwise,
yes,
these two can't talk to one another.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll change over time. It's a new movement.
The whole integrated reporting potentially, right? And that's, I think it just, it all goes back to your point of, right, if we, perhaps it's less, and perhaps, I just say perhaps, I don't know. It's less, well, we need, our financial reports and we need our ESG reports, and now we're going to integrate them together in the same, maybe it's just that the accounting standards need to catch up, right?
That's one response.
Perhaps that's a response.
That's
to
one
this,
response.
Is thinking there's just an evolution that's happened kind of separately because of whatever reason, but now it's like okay, we need to make sure that how we value companies, the valuation piece. I mean, we've seen all of that with Silicon Valley, all of the issues, and sort of probably in a way a needed swing of the pendulum back to the middle, perhaps, with valuations. Maybe it's all part of this awakening that accounting really could capture all of this. It just needs to evolve.
Yeah, and investors need to get more involved with the accounting. So I often joke, if you look at the SEC's climate proposal, they say, like $25 trillion of assets is behind this proposal. Like BlackRock and CII,
Right.
Was $25 trillion ever behind any accounting proposal? No. So, where are these $25 trillion when it comes to bread and butter stuff?
Wow.
About what is actually shown on an income statement. And, so that's the issue. I don't think, investors are as involved as they perhaps could be.
Wow.
Which means the other special interests effectively drive what gets reported.
That's so important, Shiva. Thank you so much for being here to talk
My pleasure.
about this. And we'll absolutely include your Forbes link, because you are very prolific on Forbes, and any other resources that we come up with after to put on the links page. There's so much here. And I do think that helping our audience understand that there's a lot of like underlying fundamentals issues within our financial system, within our economy, that are driving these things. This is not, someone woke up and decided that everybody needs to care about climate, right? There's underlying issues that have been probably building up for decades. I think this movement is just a symptom of all of that almost.
So if you let me have the last word.
Please.
I went through Exxon's 10K. And it's amazing you mentioned risk factors. I never hear people talk about risk factors.
I'm one of those random people that
actually reads the risk
reads
factors.
10Ks.
Oh, no, God bless your soul. We need many more of you. But out of the 25 odd risk factors that Exxon talks about, 11 to 12 are ESG.
Yes.
So that's the way to create integration in my mind.
Yes.
I just read the risk factors, I start labeling them. What is E? What is S? What is G? What is the other financial? Then go look in the sustainability report for quantification. But to your point, that this is not some random BS. Exxon, 25 of Exxon's risk factors, 11 to 12, I would safely say, are ESG issues. And there are many ESG issues not in the list of risk factors, which is the other issue.
That's the ones that made it to the 10K, right? What about, and there's a bunch more in the sustainability reporting, actually, or the ESG reporting. Right. Yeah. Any other last final thoughts?
No. I can go on and on, but we have to stop at some point. We can always talk again. Yeah.
I know. I absolutely think this is hopefully the start of many episodes. We really appreciate you coming out to the studio today to share your perspective. And I'm personally very interested now in this accounting piece, which, I would have been that person like, oh no, not accounting.
I understand.
But now I'm very, very interested in this. And so I look forward to reading more of your work as it comes out. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.